Hi, good evening, Kevin. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Good evening.
You're audible. You're audible, sir.
Good evening, sir. This is not Kavin. I'm here to substitute Kavin because he's not on the travel, so he couldn't make up to the meeting, sir.
I understand that. Can you make a co-host? Or can
Sure.
I
I made you a host, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
না না সিদ্ধার্থ ঠিক আছে এবার ঠিক আছে
Good evening, Dr. Ramni. Can you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Yeah.
Can we please make Dr. Ramni as a co-host?
Yes, sir. I have done the co-host thing, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah.
So Kavin is traveling today, so he
Oh,
won't
is
be able
he?
to join us. He's
Okay.
returning from Guwahati.
Assam, yeah.
Yes.
Conference was still yesterday, right?
Yes, sir.
Didn't you go for the conference? I thought you might have gone, and then you might
So this time, because of some
join.
domestic
Okay.
responsibilities, I couldn't join.
Okay. Yeah. I attended the online. I watched the live streaming of the inaugural function.
Great.
The lightning talks. I'm using my desktop now today.
Wonderful, sir. Great. So there is no connectivity issue.
I don't think so, unless the power goes off. But you don't have control over that.
Dr. Jason also has joined. Good evening, Jason.
Hello. Good afternoon, Jason. Is it good afternoon or good morning?
You're on mute.
Mute.
You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah.
Great, cool. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
I do.
Great. So it's morning here. Yes, 10:45.
Morning. Yeah.
How are you guys?
Morning. Fine,
Great.
thanks. Yeah. How is the weather there?
It's very nice. It's cold but nice. It's been raining this weekend, but we've got nice weather now. So yeah, good day here. How about there?
Yeah, I mean, in Bangalore, it's been raining on and off. I'm in Bangalore.
Uh-huh.
It's been raining
Oh.
on and off. I mean, today it's a bit sunny.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes at night you get the rains.
Uh-huh.
I'm joining from Pune, Maharashtra. So it's quite bright and sunny here. Wonderful weather.
Excellent. Good.
Bangalore is the second city in India known for the traffic jams, bottlenecks. After Pune. Pune is the first
True.
leader.
For traffic jams, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, bottlenecks on the roads. The roads are not very wide. Most of the roads are narrow. And then a lot of two-wheelers, who weave in and out of the traffic. So you
I
have to
remember well. I've never been to Pune or Bangalore, but the many cities I have visited across India, you have a similar situation, I think.
Yes.
But still, I didn't experience anything as bad in India as I experienced in Dhaka, Bangladesh.
Yeah.
There it's even worse.
Yeah.
Rush hour traffic in Dhaka is a nightmare.
Yeah.
And then the worst place in the world, probably Nigeria, in Lagos.
Yeah.
There people literally the cars just hit each other in order to get through the traffic. They push each other through. So yeah.
There's no statutory minimum distance to be maintained between vehicles.
Exactly. Yeah.
Bumper to bumper.
The cars look like paper mache in Lagos.
Yeah.
Great.
had expe-
Shall I just
I had-
try sharing my? Shall I
Yeah.
try sharing my slides just to make sure I
Yes,
can?
please.
Yeah.
Before we find, yes, you can please do that.
That's that one there, I think.
Okay, meanwhile, I request the audience to mention their names in the chat box. Please also mention the name of your city and what do you teach? Do you teach language or do you teach literature? We'll be very happy to know about it. Please mention your name, name of your city, and what do you teach?
Great. Can you see that slide okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Quite clear.
I will turn off my phone notifications. Great.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Shall I unshare it or shall I leave it like that?
No, please unshare it for now because we will be sharing a video. And then we will formally start. Thank you.
I remember the summer of 1986 I spent in Edinburgh
Mhm.
during the Edinburgh Festival time.
Excellent. Yes, the IETFL conference next year is in
Yeah,
Edinburgh.
it's in Edinburgh. Yeah. Our
That
national,
will be in
yeah,
April, I think.
yeah. Our national secretary, I think Xavier, might be attending that. That's what I heard.
Mhm. So you got some nice variety of participants,
Hmm.
many of whom teach both language and literature, some of whom teach predominantly language, some of them literature.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Bina teaches in the Middle East in Muscat. That's interesting.
I
So
was
you
in
have people.
Oh, I was in Muscat for nearly 9 years.
Oh wow.
2005 to 2013.
Uh-huh.
But I was in the technical education sector.
Okay, good evening, Simon.
Good evening.
Simon will be hosting the show today.
Yeah.
Simon, could you please unmute yourself? Okay, good evening, everyone. We
A
will be
quick
starting
question
with
for Rahul. Rahul, will the talk be recorded?
Yes, it will be recorded. And
will
it
it
will be
be-
uploaded
where
on
will it be?
YouTube.
Uh-huh.
We
Great.
will share
Send
you.
me a link to it.
Yeah, definitely. We will share the link once it is ready. We will have to edit it a bit and then we will upload it on YouTube.
Excellent.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We will start the webinar shortly. In the meantime, I request all of you to Write your name. Please tell us where are you joining us from, and also tell us whether you teach language or literature. Saima, we are unable to hear you. Please unmute. Yeah, no, we are still not able to hear you properly. Is she audible, Jason?
Not to me, no.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay.
Now.
Hello, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to have you all join us for ELTAI webinar 127, brought to you by the English Language Teachers Association of India. My name is Bhaskar, and I'll be your host for this exciting session today, which is on the topic language versus literature question in Indian ELT. I can see many people are joining. It's wonderful to have you all with us today. We shall begin shortly, but before that, I would like to take a moment here to let you all know that we just had our 18th International and 54th Annual ELTAI Conference held in Guwahati, Assam, co-hosted by Royal Global University and Sonapur College. We had a fantastic turnout and received an overwhelmingly positive response. It was truly inspiring to connect with so many of you passionate educators and share our ideas. And now it would be nice to know a bit about you as well before we actually begin. So you can let us know where you're joining from. Please share your name and where you're from in the chat box. And since today's session revolves around the language versus literature discussion, we would also like to hear about your teaching focus. Like, do you primarily teach language, or do you teach literature, or a bit of both? Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
We have T.H. Lawrence in the meeting. That's lucky. Somebody in the
Hi.
chat calls themselves T.H.
Thank
Lawrence.
you.
Any relation?
I can see responses pouring in. Paresh Thakur says he is from Gujarat and he teaches English literature in arts.
And Kavita is from Hyderabad,
Hello,
teaching
Dhaneshwar.
English language. A nice variety of different parts of India and focuses as well.
We have E. Balamurali from Sri Krishna College of Engineering and Technology, teaching both language and literature. Hello.
And Hamidur from Dhaka, which is Bangladesh, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome. Manoj is here. A few faces I recognize. A few names, rather.
Hello, Ashish. Ashish teaches English language to high secondary students. Most of you are still joining. Hello. Hello, everyone. Dr. Afzal Zamal is a research supervisor and teaches English language. Nice. We have Larni E. Sultan from Manipur, who is a research scholar in ELT and translation. All right. Hello, good evening, everyone. We have Jashan Chopra from Amritsar, Punjab, who teaches both language and literature. Hello, Livano. Livano from New Delhi says she teaches both literature and language to high school students, I guess.
Okay, Saima, it's 4:30 now. We are good to go.
All right. Okay. Okay. Thank you for your responses. All right. Some people are still joining. So once again, I welcome you all to today's webinar, which is on the topic, the language versus literature question in Indian ELT. I believe this is one topic that will resonate deeply with educators and language learners alike. But before we dive into this engaging topic, I would quickly like to give out a few general instructions. First is that if you have any questions while watching the webinar, please post your questions in the chat box. Our moderator will pick the questions from the chat box so that our resource person can respond to them. And secondly, please do not forget to fill out the feedback form given at the end of the session to receive your certificates. Certificates are available for school, UG and PG students, ELTAI members, and foreign nationals. Do keep a copy of the confirmation email after submitting the form for verification if necessary. The certificates are usually issued within 10 working days, so be on the lookout, but please avoid sending follow-up emails right after the webinar to prevent delays. And now let's take a moment to get acquainted with the vibrant world of ELTAI. For those of you new to our community or simply just need a refresher, we have a brief video to showcase some of the incredible activities and initiatives ELTAI is involved in. May I request to play the video.
What?
That was interesting as well as inspiring, isn't it? ELTAI's commitment to empowering English language educators across India is truly commendable. We hope you will consider becoming a part of this dynamic association if you haven't already. And now, allow me to introduce our esteemed moderator for today's webinar, who will be offering his expert opinion and oversee the discussion today, Dr. P.N. Ramney. Dr. Ramney is a curriculum designer, materials developer, teacher trainer, ELT administrator, and quality assurance specialist in the education sector. He is a teacher by choice with experience of over 40 years, having handled teaching and administrative assignments relating to education, both in India and the Middle East, and authored several English course books and research papers. He has initiated and implemented curricular reforms in English studies, guided and evaluated research and curricular programs in India and the Middle East, and conducted hundreds of training workshops for teachers and students on a wide range of topics. His special interests include literary education, especially at the bachelor's level, technical communication, group dynamics, and public speaking. He has been associated with ELTAI for over 4 decades now, promoting the cause of the association in various capacities and in significant ways. As master trainer, member of its executive committee, webinar organizing committee, and editor-in-chief of its print and online journals. He has also been substantially involved in ELTAI's projects, including Hornby IATEFL associate projects, the National World Champion Contest 2019, ELTAI Cambridge University's Monsoon Series for grades 1 to 8, and the India Reads Initiative. Now, without further ado, let me hand over the session to our moderator. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for introducing me. It's my pleasure to be part of today's webinar. Today is October 27th, and this webinar is the 127th of ELTAI. So I remember the first time we started the webinar series during the COVID pandemic times, when we had seminars every week, and then we switched over after a year or so to monthly webinars. And I'm also doubly pleased to be part of today's webinar because of the theme, the language versus literature education in the Indian context of ELT. Whether to teach English as language or to teach English as literature. This debate has been going on for nearly 40 years, 45 years, since the beginning of the 1980s, if I remember right. In my view, the topic is still relevant today because teachers who teach literary texts as part of the language curriculum at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of education in the Indian context. So although the literary texts are part of the language curricula, language textbooks, language teaching textbooks, they treat these literary texts as if they are teaching students who are majoring in literature at the bachelor's and postgraduate level. So times are beginning to change, but not to the extent that I would have hoped. I remember years ago when I looked at the textbook prepared by the state textbook committee of one of the southern states in India. There's a famous Milton sonnet on his blindness. One of the comprehension questions posed at the end of the poem was, when did Milton become blind? I couldn't answer the question then. I can't answer the question even now. And I was amazed. I mean, why should one be interested in when he actually became blind? How many wives he had? And other biographical details about the poets. This was the higher secondary textbook prepared for grade 11. So even today, I remember teachers going to classes when they teach literary texts. They give a very lengthy introduction about the author, about the period, the social, historical background of the period, and then they give an explication of the text in their own way. What is there left for the students to do? So they don't need to read the text by themselves. The examination questions are content-based. Either write a literary appreciation of the poem or write the character sketch of so-and-so, the plot, discuss the plot of a novel, and so on. They can answer all these questions without having read a single line of the text themselves. They go by what the teacher has given them. And these are, the class lectures are usually supplemented by notes, I mean, set of handouts, if not the bazaar guides. I don't see many bazaar guides these days. That's a good sign. But this is the context in which today's webinar has been scheduled. I'm doubly happy to know that Dr. Anderson from the University of Warwick in the UK, who is a teacher educator, author himself, educational consultant for ministries of education and institutions in over 30 countries across the world, including the UNICEF and the British Council, is the resource person for today's webinar. He has published award-winning books on research on aspects of language teaching, teacher education, teacher expertise, and teacher reflection. His latest book, with the title Teacher Education Expertise in the Global South, published by the Cambridge University Press, investigates what quality in education actually means in the Global South and why it is often misunderstood or overlooked by educational reform initiatives. There have been many initiatives for bringing about reforms in education, but most of these initiatives have not taken into account the teacher expertise, which is a crucial aspect of any educational context. His research interests include the complexities of teaching and the diverse experiences of teachers around the world, which is rich experience of spending his time in more than 30 countries. You can trust that he has plenty of experience of teachers' perceptions, learners' perceptions about teaching, and the teacher's expertise, which he has tried to draw out from the teachers themselves. He's also interested in the experiences, challenges, and problems which are often overlooked and under-researched. He's interested in both pre-service and in-service education, including pedagogy, curriculum design, lesson planning, materials development, teacher research, and formative modes of assessment. Within language teaching, he also investigates and writes about methodology, the past, present, and the potential future, including aspects of multilingualism and translanguaging in the English classroom. So I don't think you can have a better person with an expertise, greater expertise than Dr. Anderson to be talking about the Indian ELT. And it's up to us, practicing teachers in the Indian context, to corroborate what Dr. Anderson might observe about the Indian ELT scene, and if necessary, even disagree with some of his observations, provided we have sufficient evidence to back them up. So I'm looking forward to a very engaging and interactive webinar today with as many participants as possible taking part in a couple of polls, surveys that he's going to be including as part of his presentation. And he might stop his presentation at a couple of points to wait for you to raise questions, seek clarifications, and make observations and comments. Over to Dr. Anderson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Right, let me just share the slides. We'll just work to check that you can see them before I begin. There we go. Great, now I can see the slides in my interface. Can you guys see them okay? Great, thanks for that thumbs up. Okay, great. So thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dr. Ramani. Yes, that general introduction didn't mention the fact I didn't share some points on this. I conducted my PhD research in India, investigating teacher expertise there and finding lots of teacher expertise. But today's talk is about this important question about how we should teach English in India. And having visited India, having actually presented at the ELTAI conference myself back in 2017 when it was in Cochin, back then on translanguaging, I feel very much part of the ELTAI community, and I know this is an important topic for ELTAI. I'm going to be coming at the topic very much from the perspective of somebody who has learned to teach English as a language. In fact, my knowledge of English literature isn't very good at all. And one of my foundational beliefs is that in order to be able to teach English literature or the literature of any language, learners obviously need basic literacy in the language in question, and they need basic comprehension skills and basic thinking skills to enable them to do so. So let's have a quick look at the overview of the talk. I'll begin with the kind of an introduction with a key background and overview of the key problem. Then there will be 3 polls and some opportunities for you guys to share your opinions in the chat. We've got nearly 200 people, so thank you so much for coming. And feel free at any point if you want to make comments in the chat and ask questions. If I've got time, I will try to address them, or if there's any misunderstanding, let me know, something that's not clear. I'll then follow with some recommendations and advice which are based on my recent consultation for this talk of a number of experts or individuals who I consider to be experts on ELT in India. And then there'll be time for questions and further comments. My hope is to ensure that you all give your opinion, because my opinion will be quite one-sided. So, key terminology. Let's actually make sure we're clear about what we've got here in terms of the kind of the 2 main positions and one potentially in the middle. Teaching English as language typically involves prioritizing the teaching of the basic skills in English, as often happens in so-called EFL, English as a Foreign Language, EFL context. It covers the development of the basic vocabulary and grammar acquisition and reading, writing, speaking and listening skills, as well as initial literacy development in English as a written language, which for many Indian learners, it's important always that we are aware is an additional script. Most of them learn to write in Devanagari or other scripts, and therefore English presents that additional challenge for Indian learners. Teaching English as literature tends to prioritize the appreciation of novels, poetry, plays, and other literary works, as typically happened in contexts that we call ESL, English as a second language, and it prioritized reading and writing skills and development of more advanced awareness of lexis, style, metaphor, etc. A third option there, which, thank you to Amol Padwad for raising my attention to this, Professor Prabhu in 1995 talked about the potential for a third option, teaching English through literature. And Dr. Ramani may also be able to shed light onto this, because I think it goes back quite a long way as well. The idea that literature is the means by which we teach English as language. So in fact, we use those texts to scaffold language learning. An interesting option, one I don't know so much about, so I won't be touching on it, but I did want to mention it. Now, basic background situation. I think everybody here will know much of this, but it's important to reinforce this because there are some misunderstandings. Officially, of course, India is an ESL, English as a second language context, because of the status of English in India is considered to be a language which has a national position within the constitution and so on. But in reality, the important thing to remember is that there is the political distinction and there is the, if you like, the socio-cultural distinction. On a socio-cultural level, it's very clear to those of us who work in Indian schools and education systems, including myself, that English is only a second language for the urban wealthy, those from the middle class, who experience it regularly in their daily lives. The vast majority of Indian learners, and today we know that probably between 60 and 70, even 75 percentage of Indian learners live and work in rural contexts. And then you add on to that the urban poor, you're at least over 80%, if not 85%. These people experience English largely, if not completely, as a foreign language. It's not really part of their daily spoken or written language use, except, for example, the use of loan words from English when they are translanguages. And I'll be referring to the ASER reports, which are published by Pratham, an international NGO, but an Indian NGO as well. Note that over 50% of grade 8 learners cannot read very short, very simple sentences in English. And I'll come back to some examples to reaffirm this point. And therefore, as Anna Malai pointed out in 2005, that the ESL method is not best suited for teaching English to these learners, to rural learners. It must be combined with the principles of teaching English as a foreign language. And the extent to which it is combined, or even in fact simply supplanted by the teaching of English as a foreign language, is an important question. And others have also argued the same point. So just to reinforce that point, today I'm going to make very clear my opinion that for the vast majority of learners, India is an EFL context, and these learners need an EFL approach. And I'll provide some evidence to support that. Now, generally speaking, and I'm not an expert on certain aspects of history, so I've just borrowed this from some of the people I've consulted. Generally speaking, tertiary education, higher education, but also in further education institutions, has typically prioritized teaching English as literature since the colonial period. But there have been important changes in primary and secondary schooling that have happened, in fact, over the last 20 years. And many people aren't aware of these. Many teachers and even many of the academics are only aware of what's happening in their state. My research and work goes across states in India, so it's an important insight in some senses. Between about 1990 and 2010, many Indian curricula moved towards a teaching English as a foreign language approach. In other words, adopting materials which are accessible, simple, easy for learners to use, focusing on practical comprehension skills as a broad basis upon which any literature approach depends. If we want to teach literature, learners need these basic skills. But one thing I've noticed that has really interested me is that since about 2010, these curricula have moved towards teaching, including a much higher proportion of literature-based texts. These can be actually extracts from the text, these can be abridged examples, and these can be texts both from English language literature and other Indian language literature. There's lots of really nice examples of Indian novels and poetry that have been translated into English so that learners can appreciate Indian literature through English. And I think that's a very valiant aim, a really nice idea. And I won't be arguing that those are the best texts to use if you do teach through literature. But this has followed, it seems that the CBSE, the Central Board for Secondary Education, were at least one of the first to do this, to increase the proportion of literature teaching in primary and secondary curricula. And to my mind, it's problematic for reasons Dr. Romani has just touched on some of them with his example from the Milton text. But I'm going to provide some more reasons, and I'm going to provide very clear evidence as to why this is having a negative impact on learning across India. I think one of the reasons why it's happening is because an increasing number of textbook development curriculum members are often English literature academics rather than English language curriculum development specialists. And hence their priority, their interest in literature is sometimes, I think, overpowering the curricula. And as I mentioned here, and many of the participants here will know this from teaching in primary and secondary school contexts, particularly rural, particularly low-income urban learners, they have here experienced huge challenges as a result. Let's have a look at what we know about learner proficiency across India in English. The ASA reports are the largest comprehensive report conducted on Indian learners' abilities across subjects, a range of subjects. It's important to note that these reports are only rural. In other words, they don't involve urban learners. Therefore, about 30 to 40% of Indian learners aren't actually in this picture. But they do give us really good insights into probably the most underprivileged learners who face the biggest difficulties. And they're not that different, in my opinion, to what we see in the urban poor, but I'll give more evidence of that in a moment. So in 2022, the latest ASA report found that 46.6% of children in grade 8 can read these 4 simple sentences. In other words, over half of them cannot even read the sentence, "I like to read," or "This is a large house." Now that's an improvement from 2016 compared to other subjects, mainly because of the COVID pandemic, we believe. There was actually a fall in ability, for example, with regard to mathematics and with regard to mother tongue literacy. So English language teaching has essentially held its own without falling. But it's important to note that this is still down on 2012, when there was a higher proportion of curricula using a more EFL, English language, rather than literature approach. But it's also important to note that of those 46% of children who can read those sentences, only a smaller proportion of them can actually understand them, meaning that in total, about 32% of rural learners in India can actually read and understand these 4 simple sentences. It's important to note that this is similar. This is not surprising. This is similar to many children in low-income contexts around the world where English does not play a part in their daily lives. In other words, EFL. Many Indian primary and secondary learners are EFL learners, and we see similar levels of proficiency across the planet. Nothing surprising. It doesn't mean that the school system is failing, doesn't mean that teachers are failing. It's what you would expect. But here's the problem. Let's now compare that with grade 8 textbooks across India today. I'm going to provide a few examples here. So here is the NCERT curriculum from grade 8. Here is an extract from one of the texts, from one of the literary texts that we find in this book, and it's a fairly general example. We can see it's a Western text by a British author. I can't even remember which one it is. But we see the receptive skills complexity of this text is about B2 level. That means you need an IELTS 6 to be able to just get the basic meaning of this text. In West Bengal, this shift to literature has been the greatest of all the states I've looked at. And nearly every text is a literary text and presents really, really big challenges for the learners. This text here, for example, includes vocabulary at the C2 level as well as the C1 level. In other words, someone like myself might be challenged by the content of these texts, and British children in secondary education would be seriously challenged. A lot of the challenging text isn't actually highlighted as in the glossary, whereas other words are. Maharashtra, we find the same. This text from an obscure kind of foreign source for an Indian rural child, Androcles and the Lion. And whilst the glossary in the column helps a little bit, you can see it's another example of a fairly strong high-level B2 level text. And Telangana. This is an example from Oliver Twist, which is a really interesting book to study if the learners speak and understand English. But of course, at this stage, they are still, remember, we're talking about the level where the students can only read the sentence, "This is a large house." And even then, the majority of them can't actually understand the meaning of that sentence. And then poetry, going back to West Bengal, here is an example of a text, quite a challenging text. Now, just to put this in context, the world expert on vocabulary acquisition, acknowledged world expert, I think, Paul Nation, makes the point that researchers suggested that learners need to know about 98% of the words in a text for vocabulary not to be a major issue in comprehension. Now look at this text from the West Bengal grade 8 curriculum, grade 8. And let's just look at which words a grade 8 learner probably is not able to understand. And let's take them out of the text to see what that child can actually understand of this text. If we are lucky, the child can probably understand what's remaining. And even then, the word "the," which doesn't, as a definite article, doesn't exist in any Indian languages, is essentially devoid of meaning. So the child basically understands that this might be a text about something that is cold and has a tree in it. That's all the child can understand independently. Let's now compare that with what a global course book would recommend for children at this level of English proficiency. Remember, there's no problem with the learners, no problem with the teachers. They're at a natural, normal level of English proficiency development where they need to be if they want to eventually study literature in the future. And here's an example from a global textbook. We have very simple, contextualized language which is supported by imagery to help learners to understand it. You've got a dialogic text to introduce learners to some very simple grammar here. This unit is looking at the description of ability using the word can, the modal auxiliary can. And you can see there's lots of nice images to help and scaffold the learning for the learners. That's the kind of text that global textbooks are recommending learners should be using at this level. Now, I'm not saying that India shouldn't adopt a literature-oriented approach, but they need to develop the basic skills before they can get there. And teaching them having something like this is just way, way, way too far beyond the learner's ability to understand. Let's now look at the urban poor. My own research in Maharashtra found that in one class with a really good teacher, an expert teacher, and in a good quality institution that was doing better than the average schools in this city, grade 10 learners were found to have quite extensive passive vocabularies, about 2,000 words. This is really impressive for children for whom English is a foreign language in grade 10. If you go to France or Spain or Italy, you won't find necessarily these high passive vocabulary levels. So this is quite commendable. And this contributes to this teacher who nearly all of the teacher's students pass the SSC exam each year. So a really good teacher in an urban context. And this means their ability level is about A2 on the CEFR, which is the Common European Framework of Reference for Language Learning. It's about a pre-intermediate level of proficiency. Now, grade 10 textbooks across India typically contain text of about B2 to C1 level complexity. This means that's 2 bands above the receptive skills ability of the average Indian learner, or rather the average rural and urban poor learner. So I analysed several texts from across these curricula, and I found that level generally. So the learners are about here, what in IELTS terms would be about a 3 in terms of their ability to score on the IELTS exam. And they need to be up here. Indian learners need to be at an IELTS 6 to understand even basically the texts that are in many grade 10 textbooks. And in many cases, they would actually need to be at a level 7, for example, to understand even the basics of the poem that I just showed you. So the basic conclusion that I come to here is that texts in current Indian primary and secondary curricula are far above the independent receptive skills. The use of such authentic texts, which are written for native speakers, increases the cognitive load of these learners because they're complex things are literary texts. As Paul Nation notes, books written for young native speakers of English typically use a vocabulary which is much larger than the vocabulary of foreign language learners. And this doesn't even mention the stylistic, schematic, and semantic complexity and cognitive load that the use of text from high literature brings. And as much as we might love those texts, until the learners have this basic proficiency, it is simply irresponsible to try to teach them English through literature. And Pritchard and Beattie, who have done a lot of research onto this, have found that in contexts such as India, where curricula are frequently too ambitious for the learners and for the teachers to be able to make use of, learning could actually go faster if the curricula were to slow down. And this is not just in English lessons. Going back to the Pratham Asara reports, the same NGO, an Indian NGO, has an initiative called Teaching at the Right Level. And their initiative has shown demonstrably with maths and mother tongue education, in other words, first language, or at least the language of literacy in the state, that once acquired, these capabilities endure over time. Teaching at the right level basically involves bringing the curriculum down to the level where the learner is, so that you teach them where they are ready to learn, rather than trying to create a curriculum that's too ambitious for them and hoping that the learners will acquire that level. They never do. And you can see the links here to the Pratham website if you're interested. Let's have a look at some evidence from the Pratham initiative. So very, very large sample size here. Reading studies across Karnataka, and this is a reading in the state national language. So this is looking at the children's ability to read in Kannada, state language of Karnataka, including grades 4 and 5, over 450,000 children across 13 districts. So this is a very large sample size. And they found that through a one-year intervention, learners' ability increased in several magnitudes during this time, simply because they were being taught their mother tongue literacy at the right level, not using material that is too difficult for them. And my prediction is that if we were to do an experiment like this using English, bringing it down to their level, we would see similar progress gains. To my knowledge, nobody has done this, but we need to do it because I think it would work. Teaching at the right level is even being exported to Africa because Pratham found such incredible gains by using this approach. And yet in ELT, curriculum writers in India don't seem to be paying attention to this evidence. Why is the question I'm asking. So now let's get some of your opinions on this question. I'm now going to show you a couple of polls, and you will be able to go to the polls yourself. Let's copy it into the chat, and you'll be able to vote on them. There's also a QR code link there, but I'll provide the QR code link on each slide as well. So here's the first question. The first question is, what challenges did you face with the increasing literature focus in textbooks and exams? And I know my position is biased, it obviously is given the information I've put there, but there are 6 different choices here. You can tick one or more of them. If you go to the Menti link there, you should be able to respond. The first one is texts are too difficult for learners. That's something that teachers often find. It's not connected to their world. In other words, it's unfamiliar. For example, a text about Charles Dickens' characters in 18th century Britain. Learners get bored with them. It leads to a very teacher-centered lesson because the teacher having to explain it in ways that Dr. Emanuel's mentioned. And they don't learn any practical language. You can't learn much practical language from English today if you're learning using Charles Dickens and Milton and so on. And there's a final column, just to prove I'm not completely biased. If you like the approach, if you think that the current focus on teaching English through literature, choose that approach there and simply tick that one. Okay, and then we'll be able to see if there's some agreement about this. And as you can see, it's updating in real time. This is one of those plugins that sometimes crashes, so fingers crossed it won't crash, but we'll see what we get, and I'll just let that run. Now, if anybody wants to make a more complex point rather than simply choosing one of these, feel free to put it into chat, and we'll be able to come back to this and maybe to harvest your opinions then as well. And Dr. Viva Devi, while we're waiting, has put a really interesting point here. That we need ELT trained teachers at undergraduate and postgraduate level. I could not agree more. It's very true. Yes, and thank you. You've written a book on communication skills. Was taught in colleges for BA English, but people with MAs aren't using it. Yeah. Dr. Amol Padwad also mentioned this point that there are too few institutions preparing English language teachers. In other words, the opportunity to do an MA-TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other language. There's very few universities offering this in India. Of course, EFL University Hyderabad has always done this, but apart from them, there are not many. Ambedkar in Delhi, I know, is introducing something like that. But I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Devi, that we need much more of a focus on preparing primary and secondary teachers for language teaching. So having a look at this this poll, we can see that a larger proportion of people are choosing the first, second, and fourth. That texts are too difficult, it's not connected to their world, and they don't learn any practical language. Less so that it leads to a teacher-centered lesson. And only 5 of the participants have actually said, no, there's no problem here, I like this approach. Let's move on to the next question. Which approach do you think Indian schools should use? And here I'm not focusing on tertiary level institutions. I think it's everyone's hope that if learners get to the level of proficiency where they can enjoy and learn from using literature, then we can use those in tertiary institutions, in universities. But unless we get their English to that B2 level, it's impossible to do this because the learners simply don't understand the language. So which approach do you think Indian school users should use? Let me just check. Oh, I just need to start up the Menti now. 1 second. Okay, great. You should be able to see the second question on the same link now. The first column is teaching English as language. In fact, I've spelt that wrongly. Apologies there. Teaching English as literature in the last column, and in the first column, sorry, and the combination in the middle. Straight away, we've got interest in a combination. Interesting. I think that's going to hold, isn't it? It's interesting watching it. And then T.H. Lawrence has made a really interesting question, which we can answer now because we'll just wait for these comments to come through. Whom will you recommend for being a member of the Textbook Development Committee, EL academics or EL specialists? My opinion here is that if it's for primary and secondary education, these need to be foreign language teaching specialists, people who understand how additional languages are learnt and acquired in countries where they are not the majority language of the community. And remember, for most Indian, rural and urban poor learners, over 80% of the Indian population are foreign language learners. So my opinion here is very strongly that we need those individuals on the board able to make the key decisions rather than the English literature specialists, because they will tend to promote texts involving complex literature. So we've got a very clear consensus of opinion here. Everybody, the majority of people here believe that there needs to be a combination of teaching English through literature as language. And that goes back to this interesting point that Dr. Prabhu made many years ago, that there is this third approach. And let's now move on to the third question. What do you think about Pratham's teaching at the right level initiative? Would it work for teaching English, do you think? If we brought the English curriculum down to the level where the learners are, would learners learn more from using it? Or do you think it would not work? We need to stick with the current approach. Let's have a look to see what we've got here. Thank you, T.H. Lawrence. Please share your opinion as well if you want to. It's always interesting to get your opinions. It was really nice to get Dr. Bipa Devi's. Just looking back through the chat. Thank you. Great. So we can see here we've got a balance of opinion here. But a balance of opinion between these two different opinions, which is either good idea, we need to implement it now, or we may need to try it out. And I would probably agree that the second option is the most pragmatic one, given that we still don't know whether that's likely to work with English language teaching. So it's an interesting point, and nobody here believes it's a bad idea. In other words, teaching at the right level seems to be a no-brainer for Indian ELT. Let's move on. So I'm going to make my kind of main conclusion here quite early so we can get on to a nice discussion, a nice chat. Oh, also, I've got some advice from some experts that we can get on to. My opinion is that essentially it's the more privileged learners who win from the current increasing interest in putting literature in textbooks designed for learners who need an EFL approach. Those children from privileged backgrounds have more exposure to literature, more enculturation in literature studies, a kind of a family habit of reading literature, more English in their daily receptive lives and in their productive communities, when they're gaming, when they're online with their friends, when they're speaking to them. This means the urban middle class benefit from this system. And these students often also have access to high quality English medium instruction. And the losers, learners from disadvantaged backgrounds for whom English is a foreign language and have little, if any, opportunity to learn English outside the classroom. And this is often compounded by teachers who themselves are challenged by the texts. In other words, we have some good evidence that many rural teachers themselves only have, especially at primary level, but even at secondary level, A1 or A2 level proficiency. And I can provide the references to support that claim if required. So they themselves are going to be challenged by these texts. And remember that this is not a minority. This is probably over 80% of Indian learners who are losing out from this current approach. And many of them are even further disadvantaged because their parents wrongly believing that it will improve their English, put them in an EMI institution, which is often of low quality and means that they no longer have access even to the mother tongue to help them learn. And my research indicates that that mother tongue access is a really important tool when learners are trying to understand complex texts in a foreign language such as English. So that's my opinion about this topic. I can't prove that, but the evidence I've provided certainly supports it. So what can we do as teachers if we can't change the curriculum? Well, I went to some of my own personal gurus and experts, individuals with whom I've worked with in my research across India, some of the expert teachers that my research has documented, and their amazing practices in their classrooms. And I asked them, what can teachers do? Because these teachers, like yourselves, are facing these challenges all along. And there was two basic kind of basic ideas that were being promoted here, and I'm going to provide some examples in a moment. The first idea is providing the learners with the means to access the text independently, rather than simply translating the whole text, explaining the content in the mother tongue, so that at least when it comes to the exam, they can complete the exam questions, which is completely understandable, to be honest, when the text is way above their level of proficiency. But the key question here is, how can we improve that proficiency? And three areas came out: the vocabulary, the understanding, and what Vinayata Raju Pratikantam calls the Indianization. I'll come back to that in a moment. And the other piece of advice was simply to supplement the curriculum with regular, simple, practical activities to improve learners' underlying proficiency. And that might be about 1 out of every 5 lessons, 1 lesson a week, to do something at the learner's level rather than the level of the curriculum content. So let's look at some of these examples. So in Telangana, Vinayata Raju Pratikantam gives the following advice. He gives lots of advice, but this is one which the one that I kind of wanted to draw out, that we need to Indianize some of these foreign texts. When there's a text which is from Charles Dickens or from a Western context, a text which has snow in it that learners may never have experienced in, say, Maharashtra, where this particular text was, we need to make it local. We need to localize it. And I'm going to show you some examples just now, and then I'll come back to this point. So if we look here, the text on the left, if we look at the screen, is an Indianized text. It's Indianized because it's an Indian text. It's written by Abhirit Chadevi and a story called Bonsai Life, and it includes lots of lovely examples of Telugu words. All of the words that are italicized are actually words from Telugu. So this is a translingual text, and it helps the learners to understand the English around the words that they know. It's about somebody visiting her sister in the city, taking lots of vegetables, a familiar situation for many Indian learners. And as a result, this text is much less problematic for children and for their teachers in Telangana state. The text on the right is what I would personally call a nightmare text. And I've heard evidence that it really is for Telugu teachers of grade 9. It's The Trial by George Bernard Shaw, an amazing piece of literature, but utterly inappropriate in an Indian secondary school curriculum. It's about the trial and the burning of Joan of Arc in 1412. It is completely alien to them. And yet, even if you are against using these texts, you still have to prepare your learners for an exam that tests it. So Vinay's advice is try to make even this text local. Think about local trials that you have in your context so that you can help learners to understand what a trial is about. Maybe even replace the foreign one with a local trial and get learners to role play it and to develop some materials based on it. If you think this is a good idea, feel free to put it in the chat. And Vinay, when I observed Vinay teaching, I watched many of his lessons. He often did this with other texts by drawing metaphors to links to Indian context and Indian learners, and sometimes even telling the learners to imagine that this is something else, which is more familiar to them. So there we go. The first simple piece of advice is to Indianize texts. Leena Mukhopadhyay, Professor Leena Mukhopadhyay from EFL University in Hyderabad, makes a really important point, one which I myself agree with strongly, that we need simply to build the learner's systematic vocabulary acquisition. And the example I showed you of the learners who had impressive vocabularies in an urban poor context, their teacher did exactly the same. But we need to build that vocabulary systematically. So we need to choose the words that we teach, and we need to help our learners to learn them. And a simple example way of how to do this is to get them to create a vocabulary column in the back of their notebooks. So there is one column for the English word and one column for the mother tongue word. And then they can go back and test themselves, they can test their partner, they can work in pairs, and they can help each other to learn this vocabulary little by little. And as Paul Nation's research has shown us time and time again, this systematic learning of vocabulary can and does work. Unlike grammar, which needs to follow natural acquisition processes, vocabulary can be explicitly taught and learned. So it's a really good idea. Leena also recommends something which I'm also a big believer in, to adopt a multilingual pedagogy. Both she and I have written on the benefits of translanguaging in Indian classrooms, using the mother tongue to scaffold that learning of English and to support it. Let's have a look at some interesting advice from Ravi Chakrakodi at the Regional Institute of English in Bengaluru, and Santosh Mahapatra from BITS Pilani. I know Ravi is here. I'm not sure if Santosh is here. These two individuals have given some really useful advice for activities that we can do around the text. In other words, we can take the text and convert it into conversations that students can practice. I'll show you an example in a moment. But also to take time every week to build these basic communication skills. For example, one lesson of each 5 with some basic work on, say, role plays or writing simple emails and so on. Let's have a look at some of the example of the materials from RAE Bengaluru. By the way, I'll share a link to the slides afterwards, so if you want the materials, you will be able to see them in detail. And I'm sure Ravi will be happy to share the materials with any teacher who needs them, and I'm sure there'll be many. So they kind of adopt what I would call a structured freedom approach. First of all, with this Unit 12, which is about traveling, something much more practical than many of the units are about, or those units that are about traveling often have literature from a few hundred years ago about someone traveling. This is about people traveling today. And it's about the simple, basic physics of getting somewhere on a bus in India. So it's practical, it's useful, it's interesting. And you can see the text is fairly simple. So all it does is it requires the learners to listen and to complete some gaps. And even if you don't have that, you can get the learners to read out the text in pairs and then get them to develop their own role play based on it. Really simple but nice idea. And here's another idea. These can be Indian texts, Indian features that we look at and we use. So for example, RAE Bengaluru have some project-based materials such as this one, where learners actually look at stamps. Stamps are an important part of Indian culture and history, but nice and simple, something we can draw upon to build those English skills. Learners look at some really nice examples of stamps, and then in the project activity, they have to create their own stamp, choosing their own Indian hero and creating a stamp based on it. Really simple idea, but the kind of thing that I would argue is much more appropriate for the EFL approach that many. Kuheli Mukherjee in West Bengal. Kuheli was one of the expert teachers I worked with, and one of the things I noticed, and this was her advice as well, that doing a little bit of chit chat with your learners every day. Kuheli does it at the start of the lesson. When she goes into class, textbooks, she says, close your textbooks, let's have a chat. How was your weekend? How was your lunch and so on? How was your tiffin? And and so on and so forth. And by doing this, she helps those learners just to build those basic communication skills, both those who are speaking and those who are listening and hearing. And she sometimes gets them to do it in pairs as well. Coeli also used humor and other things as well in her teaching to help them. Another expert teacher working in Maharashtra, Nurjanai Khwaja, who I worked with for a long time, also gives the advice to kind of break up that complex curriculum with language games. Nurjan often linked the games to the curriculum content. And this links to the idea of Dr. Lina Mukhopadhyay, who's arguing we need to teach the vocabulary explicitly. Nurjahan also did this. She taught them the vocabulary, and she then did games to practice this vocabulary. For example, find the word. She would stand in front of the students and say a word, and then the first person who could find it would put their hand up and spell it. It was that simple. And by doing so, she's encouraging the learners to scan the text carefully. And often they would translate it, either get the learners to translate it or she would translate herself. And sometimes with higher level learners, she would get them to share the definition in English as well. And slap the board, you get two learners to come to the front of the class, teach them what the verb slap means, and then you say, where there's lots of words written on the board, you say one of the words in the local language, for example in Marathi, and then the first one who can slap the word in English, the equivalent word, the closest equivalent, wins a point for their team. So these kind of fun games will just add a bit more energy back into the lesson, we hope, for many of the learners. And then Dr. Amol Padwad, formerly from Ambedkar University, he gave some really interesting advice, I thought, that we need to be honest. We as teachers, when we have difficulty with a text written in a foreign language, which we don't understand, it's okay to say so. And to go to your colleagues and say, I don't understand this text about a trial. What is it about? Why is it starting here? How do I teach this? And then working together with your colleagues, either in your school or your district, maybe create a small teacher activity group. You can work together to hopefully help build your understanding of that text. Because if you understand it, that will at least enable you to explain it to the learners, even if you have to use the mother tongue to do so. But also be honest to your learners that these are difficult texts. In other words, if a learner says to your teacher, what does that mean? And you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know. What do you think it means? Shall we look online? Shall we check it? Shall we research it together? And researching those texts together is a really useful way of building the learner's autonomous skills, because they can then research other texts in their future, which is going to be particularly useful at university level. And so on. You get the idea. So here are some basic ideas for what things we can do. I dare say that many of you are doing them. Vinay's idea to Indianize the text, I thought was a really nice idea. When you get these foreign texts, try to make them more local, more friendly. The ideas of breaking up the text with more enjoyable activities such as chit chat or games. And the idea as well to systematically build their vocabulary. And it's okay to use the mother tongue to do this. It's very efficient and it often works well. Even though some words don't have exact equivalents, I myself as a language learner have always used my mother tongue to learn languages. And I'm very proud to say I speak 6 different languages now, 5 or 6, depending on what you mean by speak. So my conclusion, and we've got plenty of time for chat and for discussion, so get yourselves ready. My opinion here is that the vast majority of Indian children are EFL learners, not ESL. Anna Malai agrees with me, and so do many other experts. These same learners are the most disadvantaged in India. They are the rural learners and the urban poor who simply don't have access to English in their daily lives. The current increase in the use of literature that we're seeing in many states across India is making it more difficult for these learners to learn. And in this sense, we need to go back to the kinds of texts that, for example, Maharashtra used before 2009, or Orissa used before back in the 1990s. This is because the texts are, first of all, linguistically far too complex for the learners. That's the basic reason, more than anything else. But also the contexts are sometimes unfamiliar because the contexts of high literature are often from other countries, which can be useful, but only if learners understand the content. And the cognitive load is too heavy. Literature, we love it and we embrace it because of what it helps us to think and how to develop our ideas. But that doesn't help learners to acquire the original language, which is why I personally am concerned about the idea of teaching English through literature as well, because you're still dealing with really difficult texts. So to take Pritchett's and Beattie's quote, learning could go faster if curricula and teachers were to slow down. Teachers can't slow down because they've got the curricula and the exams, which are up here. But if they slow down, as Pratan's Teaching at the Right Level initiative has told us, more learning will happen, in my opinion. And those of us who can't change our curricula, and the vast majority of us can't, note these ideas from some of the experts, and I'm sure you'll be able to share your own ideas when we can move on to the conversation in a moment. Indianizing foreign texts, teaching useful vocabulary systematically, including simpler, more practical activities and chit-chat, using a multilingual pedagogy such as translanguaging, and being honest with ourselves, our colleagues, and our learners about this. So there we go. You should be able to find my slides through this link here. Let me see if I can copy the link into the chat. Not there. I'll be able to do it somewhere. I'll put the link in the chat in a moment. And many thanks to all of the individuals who provided help. I would have asked many more of the experts I know in India, but because of time and opportunity, I wasn't able to. And we should hopefully be able to go over to the conversation and to involve Dr. Ramani and some of those of you who are interested in sharing your opinion. I'd love to hear. I'll put the link to the slides in the chat in a moment. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on to the next stage. Oops. Copy. Put this in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anderson,
Thank you.
for your excellent presentation. I'm sure that the participants will agree that Dr. Anderson has put the issue in perspective. I deliberately forgot to mention Dr. Anderson's visits to India and his experience of looking at our textbooks, especially at the primary and secondary level textbooks. I attended the Cochin conference, ELTAI conference. I was there, but I didn't want to sound too familiar at the outset. He began by defining the two key terms in the topic: teaching English as language and teaching English as literature. And I was happy when he introduced a third perspective given by Dr. Prabhu way back in 1995, teaching English through literature. So that trend hasn't caught up as well as it should have. We had people like Alan Maley here in Chennai, the British Council. Many of you may be familiar with the books he wrote, the workshops he conducted when he was in Chennai. I was very much part of those programs, activities. So Maley and Duff, couple of books on teaching language through literature. Sounds interesting. A poem into story, story into poem. In one of his articles, the title of the article, I still remember, he said, "Down from the pedestal." Down from the pedestal. He suggested that we bring literature from the high pedestal that we teachers of English literature used to place it on, and then make literature accessible to the second language, foreign language learners by using literature as a pretext, as one of the texts. That's what we do, informational texts. a text from history textbook or science textbook, an article on space research, space programs, travel logs. We use literary text also as a pretext in the classroom to promote communication among the learners around the issues, the words, the topics, the themes that are embedded in the piece of literature that is prescribed. And Dr. Anderson has also given you plenty of suggestions, practical suggestions, which he has, in consultation with several experts from India, gave him on how to overcome the difficulty of the linguistic difficulty that the learners, majority of the learners face in tackling literary text, the contextual difficulty, the problem that they face in understanding the context in which the literary text is based. For many years, even today, I think Daffodils is one of the favorite poems included in school textbooks. When my heart leaps when I behold a rainbow in the sky, 10,000 saw I at a glance. Where do you see daffodils in India? So one of the suggestions given is to Indianize the text. Rather than Indianize the text that is already there, we use text written by Indian writers in English
Exactly.
or English translations of works written in Indian languages, so that we get rid of the cultural barrier. I mean, the cultural context is familiar to the students. So one major difficulty is obstacle is removed for the students. And in the choice of text also, selection and choice of text, make sure that the lexis, the vocabulary level is within the grasp of our learners. Although Krashen would say N+1, comprehensible input. I mean, pitch it at a slightly higher level than the present level of proficiency in the language. So a host of practical suggestions have been made, which means that the practicing teacher in the classroom has to be aware of the difficulties of the learners, has to believe that he has to do something to make it more accessible to the learners. If those 2 points are kept at the back of the mind of the teachers, then in their own practical wisdom, I think they will find out practical solutions as they go along. I mean, I believe in the fact that every teacher in every classroom, in every period that he teaches, every hour that he spends inside the classroom, has some insight or the other. And these insights are often forgotten because they are not documented, they are not reflected, they are not shared. Teachers think that they know how to manage things. I mean, they find an immediate solution, they overcome the problem. They don't give value to their own reflective practices. If they believe in sharing the difficulties and also the solutions with their colleagues within the same department, the same school, or across a few schools in the same district, Amal has suggested, Amal Padwad has suggested, teachers can find solutions to these problems. This, I take it as one of the key takeaways from Dr. Anderson's presentation today. Be aware of the problem, but don't be bogged down by it, and don't be desperate in saying we can't do anything about it. This is the textbook, this is the curriculum that's been given to us. and we have to deliver it in the classroom. So we can't do anything about it. You can, every practicing teacher can find a way out. But remember that students, you are there because of the students. If students don't understand what is presented to them, then there's no point in teaching. Very often in Indian context, the washback effect is very dominant. The effect of exams on the way you teach in the classroom very often dictates what we do and what we don't do inside the classroom. If there is a question in the exam which says, quote from memory the following lines from this poem, then we have to prepare the students from the primary class for a board exam which comes in class 10. If there are specific vocabulary questions devoid of context, then you prepare them for that in the classroom. You write all the difficult words on the board, explain their meanings, and then you think that vocabulary difficulty has been overcome. So please try to change the examination system indirectly by following helpful practices, helpful for the learners inside the classroom, and share your insights with colleagues in informal and formal ways. Conferences and seminars and webinars like this are the right places for you to share your ideas and suggestions. Then all will be good. So English, teaching English language through literature will be the main takeaway for me. I think it should be for everybody else. Instead of bringing down the level of the text to the level of the learners, then there will be questions raised about standard. How do you define standard? Is standard something that is there on a piece of paper, curriculum document, but it doesn't happen inside the classroom? That is not standard. So if you think that you have to maintain standards by showing people outside that you have prescribed Milton's sonnet on his blindness, Wordsworth's daffodils, and so on, then that is not standard. What the students are able to do with that text inside the classroom, that defines the standard. So these are some of my closing observations. I don't see any serious questions raised in the chat box. Some other questions which were raised by people like Lawrence, I think Anderson, Dr. Anderson has responded to them, answered those questions. Yeah.
Some interesting comments though as well, which will be good to just address. Just recently, Sumita Sarkar mentioned, and this is a common situation that you yourself have just mentioned, Dr. Ramani. Classroom transactions in Indian context are purely guided by examination patterns, syllabus, and curricula. This is the same everywhere today. It's not just India. In China, they have an exam called the Gaokao, and you see teachers pretty much from the start of grade 10 in China, just like in India, teaching pretty much towards the exam. This will always happen. It always has happened. It's happened for hundreds of years now. And we as teachers adapt to it. And our rule of thumb is always teach them the subject first, and then as you get to the exam year, it's no problem if you have to do that. That's normal. Unfortunately, we have it in the UK today. It's part of the exam culture. So don't feel like Indian teachers are different there. We all have this challenge. Earlier in the text, somebody called Shahila Zafar mentioned an important point. Yes, sorry, Dr.
Can I
Ramani.
respond to that observation about exams influencing the classroom teaching practices? Yeah, you can always prepare the students for the exam a month before the exam. You don't have to waste the whole year doing that. But spend, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, that in some contexts, if you have to teach 5 poems, at least teach 1 poem in a way that helps the learners, and you may teach the others, in the traditional way, summarize, give plot summaries and things like that. prepare them for the types of questions that they face in the exam. But if you gradually increase the percentage, the proportion of text that you do effectively in the classroom, involving the learners, involving them in conversations around the text, then in course of time, they'll be able to face any kind of exam on their own because they will have developed the basic competence in the language to be able to cope with the text on their own. So I think that can be one way of coming out of it. There have been, in all the meetings of teachers and so on, conferences, one of the usual recommendations for the last few decades has been reduce the class size to 20. It never happens. In a country like India, the class size can never be 20. There are, I mean, the teachers have to face classes of 40, 50, 60. I mean, when I was in the Middle East, one of the countries, Republic of Yemen, I had to teach skills, English language skills, reading, writing, listening, in a class of 100. So there are countries, in India also, it hasn't happened. Similarly, the curriculum has to be changed. You know how the curriculum is designed by boards of studies and so on. I don't want to go into details. So we as practical teachers, what can we do? Please focus on that. Sorry, Dr. Anderson, you were referring to some other comment on the chat box.
Yeah, I'm just going back up in the chat because there's so many interesting and so many people saying thank you. There's a couple of things we've missed out. It's really interesting though. Just to mention, there's a couple of questions. But before I go into the questions, just to address Shahila Zafar's point.
What will be the fate of students, ELT students, in terms of job prospects? That's a question raised by Dr. Vibha Devi.
Yeah. Well, we can answer that one definitely. If everyone's aim is to get the learners' English proficiency high enough so they can use that English, regardless of whether it's English for literature, which itself develops so many useful skills, or whether it's English for work. But we need, in that sense, to take the approach that starts from where the learners are. And this is why I would call any research organizations and curriculum authorities to try this simple approach of going back down to the learner's level and seeing if that leads to more learning than using the current textbook materials. I myself, when I was invited to teach a lesson in several rural classrooms in Maharashtra and Telangana, I would typically go to the staff room and choose an old textbook from a grade several grades below where the learners are. And then teachers would often be surprised at how much the students could participate in the lesson because they understood the content, because they could do the activities. And as a result, even though the material itself was lower, my feeling was, and their feeling was, that they were learning more from it.
So that takes us to the question of whether we need prescribed materials for teaching English at all.
Well, yes, I would argue we definitely do, and I would argue the use of authentic texts has always been problematic in EFL. Because authentic texts are not graded for learners. As Poor Nation has made time and time again, your average story for an English child, and this is quoting from Poor Nation, is about 5,000 words. And even those students who are doing really well in urban Maharashtra were still not at half of the proficiency level required for that kind of text. So whilst they probably can just work their way through it, it's painful, it's not enjoyable. Whereas if we take out those complex words, make easy readers, use simple texts, learners will learn more and they'll enjoy it as a result. So the whole authentic text issue is one which I've never really seen the validity of in EFL context.
Yeah.
We've got a question from, I'm just going back up, Rahul asks actually, this is an interesting one, Rahul, thank you for this. Should we just limit ourselves to Indianizing the texts, or should we also think about Indianizing the English language tests? Even today, IELTS, TOEFL, or many other exams are still completely alien to our Indian students. It's an interesting one. The fact is that IELTS and TOEFL are international tests, so in that sense, they can't be Indianized. But IELTS and TOEFL are not based on literature from several hundred years ago.
Yes.
At least they are based on discourse types that people need in their work context today. If it's IELTS, they're the kind of discourse that those learners will need to study internationally. Or if it's the IELTS general text, more practical texts that will be international. So in that sense, my personal feeling is that, yeah, they could be more Indian, definitely. And I think India can and should develop its own measures of Indian English proficiency that prioritize the needs of Indian learners. And as the biggest country in the world today, of any, and the biggest country that uses English, India has the power to do that, to create its own exams, but which I'd love to see. But IELTS and TOEFL, I'm afraid it's very unlikely that they will change to the needs of Indian learners. And Dr. and T.H. Lawrence again made a question much earlier in the conversation. What do you think should be the level or grade at which grammar may be introduced to students or included in the curriculum in an ESL country? Well, India isn't an ESL country, as I hope the evidence I've provided shows that. Official policy is nothing to do with learners' need. And from the teaching, from a pedagogic perspective, you need to decide whether it's ESL or ASL based on where the on the learners, not on the official policy. Just turning English into the official language doesn't make it appropriate to use an ESL pedagogy. But if it was an EFL country such as India, well, we know there's a lot of evidence that tells us that very young learners are not able to learn grammar rules. They absorb grammar from using it meaningfully in context. And this continues until a child gets to about 8, 9, or 10, at which age they can start to actually become aware, to develop their meta language, as we call it, about language, knowledge of language. So then the learning of grammar rules does actually have some benefit, particularly for written language use, which is important in India. So I would argue that probably if you're teaching in India and you're teaching grammar, if you're teaching younger age learners, try to teach the language meaningfully. So if you're teaching the auxiliary verb can, don't put it on the board and write a rule. Tell them what you can do and ask them what they can do, and get them to show you in the classroom. I can fly like a plane. That kind of thing will help the learners to absorb can rather than learning the explicit rule of can. And then, but when they do get to about 10, 11, 12, the lower secondary grades, then they can start to learn some of these rules before practicing them, even though there is a complex relationship between that explicit knowledge and the so-called implicit learning, which Gratian used to call acquisition. I reject that distinction, but the implicit learning itself can then build on that gradually, as Rod Ellis has shown. Through the
This is an example of several things that we do which are not natural processes. So even in grade 1, we start giving the definitions of a noun. The noun is a name of a place, person, or thing.
Yeah.
Now, these definitions, it doesn't make sense at all. Start making, you use the language in context. Use simple context in which nouns are used, verbs are used, adjectives are used, without telling them that these are nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. As Dr. Anderson said, only after a certain age, they're able to rationalize, they can understand explicit rules, and then they apply, they remember, they begin to ask questions why.
Yeah.
When they're ready to ask questions why is it that we have to use verb ending in s for this sentence and not the other one? That's the point at which grammar has to be taught formally.
Yeah. If you think about the development of an Indian child, when they go to, they're already able to use Indian languages completely proficiently when they go to school in spoken form, and yet they may still not know what the word for a noun is in Hindi, for example, or in Canada, and yet they can use them. So there's no need for that knowledge to be taught until they get to the secondary levels, when it does become useful, by the way. I do agree with teaching at those levels, but certainly not at early levels. Simply get them to use language. First languages, words we should be teaching are hello, how are you, what are you doing, what game are you playing? Language that is useful and relevant to little children.
Yeah, one of the examples of Indianization would be, we used to teach nursery rhymes at the kindergarten level and primary level. London Bridge is falling down. Jack and Jill went up the hill.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
mean, this kind of thing, ding dong bell pushes in the cab. I mean,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
so
And
these
simple
you can
simple
instead of these, you
rhymes
can
like that.
local rhymes can be used. I mean, these are simple
Absolutely.
things
Yeah.
that we can use. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Look, there's lots of things that we can use and to help them at those levels. Yes.
And some teachers are doing that, but as I said, these are not being shared widely so that more teachers become aware of these experiments.
Yeah. And just going back to one other comment which was mentioned earlier by Dr. Polisetti Viswanath. Dr. Viswanath mentions, I taught a text named Language Through Literature for engineering graduates. It's a really good book to justify both perspectives, in other words, teaching language through literature. Unfortunately, the project failed as both teachers and students couldn't use it well. Well, if it failed, maybe it isn't such a great book, because no curriculum which teachers cannot use is a useful curriculum. Don't blame the teachers if the curriculum is too difficult. Blame the curriculum designers, because it's those people who have made the mistake. Remember, as I always say, the average teacher is an average teacher. That sounds like a stupid thing to say, but it's really important to understand that if we build curricula at a level where the teachers can't use them, they won't work. We need to understand the teachers, develop the curriculum with the teachers, not just consulting them, but working with them so that they've got a curriculum that they like and they believe they can use. If you do that, then the textbook will work. But any curriculum where the teachers and learners couldn't use it very well is not a successful curriculum by definition, regardless of how much we may like the literature and the ideas in there.
So thank you, Dr. Anderson, for very good interaction and your responses to so many questions. I'd like to wrap it up by thanking you and then just giving one final observation, making a final observation. When Dr. Prabhu's book authored by him, English Through Reading, published by Macmillan, it had a very good, English Through Reading, book 1, book 2. It had a teacher's manual. When it was introduced, and there's a textbook, it failed. After a year or two, it had to be withdrawn because most of the teachers were not given the teacher's manual how to use the textbook in the classroom. So they were not aware of the teaching tips and so on. They taught this as they used to teach the traditional anthologies, like, explicating the text, lecturing on the text and so on, which is why a well-written textbook also failed. So there's a whole host of complex issues relating to the Indian ELT scene. The recognition of the fact that the average teacher is an average teacher, that should be a very sound kind of reminder, Dr. Anderson. We need to keep that in mind. So whatever be the curriculum statements, policy statements, language policy, the textbooks, we need to accept that as the ground reality and then work to improve the situation based on that. Thank you very much. I thank all the participants for having actively participated by raising questions and making observations in the chat box. Over to you, Saima.
Thank you, Dr. Ramani. It was a very engaging and thought-provoking discussion that we had today. On behalf of ELTAI, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jason Anderson, for his time and insights. Thank you, sir. Your exploration of this debate in Indian ELT between teaching English as language versus teaching it as literature has certainly given us all of us, a lot to consider, especially regarding its influence on curricula. I'm sure our participants have found your insights on the benefits and the limitations of these two approaches and their impact quite benefiting. We are truly grateful for encouraging us to reflect on this topic. So thank you once again. I thank Dr. P. and Ramani for moderating this session and offering his expert remarks. I also would like to thank you, sir, for guiding us through the Q&A session and facilitating such a dynamic exchange of ideas. Your thoughtful handling of questions really added depth to our discussion and helped us gain new perspectives. We truly appreciate your contribution in making this session a very engaging and interactive one. A special vote of thanks is also due to the dedicated team that has worked tirelessly to ensure the success of ELTAI webinars. I would like to acknowledge the support from Rahul Kale and Kavin from the organizing team for their hard work and commitment to organizing these webinars. And last but certainly not least, we extend our warm and heartfelt thanks to our participants, which almost, I think, numbered up till 210 today from abroad as well as India. We had participants who joined us today from Muscat, Uzbekistan, Malaysia, Iran, and many other locations around the globe, as well as from all corners of India. Your active participation, questions, and insights have made these webinars not just informative, but also it makes it a platform for rich discussions and global collaboration. To receive certificates, I once again request you, dear participants, to fill out the feedback form. Kindly note that certificates will be issued only to school, UG, and PG students, ELTAI members, and foreign nationals. Ladies and gentlemen, before I wrap up, a few more announcements. Please mark your calendars and save the date for our next insightful ELTAI webinar. On Sunday, November 24, 2024, we have a captivating session planned for you on the topic, Doing Poetry, a Way to Become Comfortable with the Uncomfortable, by Dr. Pranima Bakshi from Sri Sri University, Orissa. Can we have the poster for the next webinar? Yes, I think you can already see the poster on the screen. Registration details and additional information about this exciting webinar will be shortly available on our website. So please be on the lookout for that. And remember, your active participation is not only encouraged, but essential to the success of our events. Let's continue our journey of professional development together. And now it's time for a group photograph. So I would like to request everyone to turn their videos on and put on a smile.
I request everyone to turn their videos on, please. Okay, please be ready for the photograph. Okay, one more time. So much, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. With this, I, Saimanadin Laskar, take your leave. Once again, thank you so much for your attendance. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, guys. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jason, thank you, Dr. Ramni, and thank you, Saima.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.